Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Now this week in the news, we have another deadly school shooting, this one just north of Seattle, Washington. We also have a clip that we're going to hear from the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. But first, let's talk about the whole boots on the ground thing we keep hearing about. Now, boots on the ground is a catchphrase the White House likes to use to pacify Americans who are sick of going to war. But the reality is, we're back at war in Iraq and many other parts of the Middle East, which means there will be boots on the ground. Now, General Martin Dempsey, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S., basically the highest-ranking military officer in the entire U.S. Armed Forces, has just admitted it.
Interesting. In a recent ABC News interview, General Martin Dempsey was asked, would we be more effective against ISIS if we had U.S. troops on the ground? To which he responded, there will be circumstances when the answer to that question will likely be yes. He continued, when the Iraqi army has to go on the offensive to take back cities ISIS has already overtaken, the U.S. will probably then put the boots on the ground.
In other words, it is for sure.
That's for sure.
So even though President Obama keeps saying no boots on the ground over and over, we should realize that more than likely this is just another attempt to ease Americans back into war with Iraq.
Well, we also look at war on a smaller scale. Out of Washington State, 2 people are dead after a gunman opened fire at a Washington high school. Of the 2 dead, one is the gunman who was a student of that very same school. He died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. This time, the shooting took place at Marysville-Pilchuck High School. That's in Marysville, a city about 35 to 40 miles north of Seattle. 3 other students are listed in critical condition after being shot in the head and underwent surgeries to address those wounds. A 4th student is being treated at a nearby hospital also.
And of course, the school was evacuated and law enforcement swept the school to make sure there were no other threats. Now, once again, this is an ongoing investigation which will leave many questions unanswered, seeing how that the person behind this devastation is now deceased.
Very sad. We now turn our focus to a meeting in Sochi where Vladimir Putin spoke of the ongoing crisis facing his nation and abroad. He also spoke very freely concerning who and what he felt was the cause behind many of the conflicts, terrorist groups, and agendas that have been growing in the recent years. Take a look and listen closely at what he had to say.
We still don't have an understanding of who is responsible for supporting this said world order. Even its definition needs to be clarified these days. A number of nations, including the United States, have decided that what happened in the 1990s was their victory and the unipolar world has a right to exist. But soon it turned out that the West was overstating their capabilities. Meanwhile, new players were coming up to the international arena and they were capable of independent action. At the same time, mutual interdependence of nations is increasing due to the development of this globalized world. There were issues which showed that they were quite contentious, such as the nuclear arms issue. Some of the participants of the opening session believed that nuclear disarmament was the right solution. Others believed that nuclear arms played an important deterrence role, especially at the time when conventional weapons were evolving rapidly. There was also a discussion about whether we will see an end of the U.S. power, or is this country is just at the peak of its power and influence. Diplomats have a tongue to avoid speaking the truth. Well, we're not like that. We actually gather here to speak our minds, and we need some harsh and truthful assessments, not in order to debate with one another and point fingers, but in order to figure out what's been going on in the world and why the world has become ever less predictable and more prone to risks, and why the risks are increasing everywhere. Global politics are primarily about economic leadership, issues of war and peace, and humanitarian issues, including human rights. There have been a lot of contradictions building up in the world, and we need to ask one another in good conscience whether we have a good insurance against confrontation. Unfortunately, there are no guarantees that the existing system of global and regional security is capable of securing us against turbulations. That system has been seriously undermined and deformed. Unfortunately, the United States, who consider themselves the winners of the Cold War, believe that there is no need in those checks and balances. And instead of trying to secure stability in the world, they actually took measures that led to a strong disbalance. Instead of stability, we see increasing chaos. Instead of democracy, we see them supporting some very murky activists, from open Nazis to very dangerous Islamic fundamentalists, because those forces are used initially as instruments, but then they just go out of control, and their so-called masterminds get burned on that. I can't help wonder how time and again they continue to repeat their own mistakes. They used to sponsor Islamic extremist movements to fight the Soviet Union. They were tried and tested in Afghanistan and later gave rise to Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The West used to turn a blind eye, or I would actually say even support financially and in media terms to support those terrorists and their invasion in Russia. We have always seen terrorism as a number one global challenge, one that you cannot block out by using double standards, one that you cannot afford to ignore. We saw our counterparts ostensibly agree with us, but in a while everything just went back to normal, in their opinion. They interfered in Iraq and in Libya, and actually Iraq is now on the brink of disintegration thanks to their action. Iraq is now a playground for terrorists, and it's only thanks to the wisdom of the Egyptian government that helped deliver Egypt from a same fate. In Syria, the United States started to supply terrorists with weapons and hardware, and facilitating an inflow of volunteers into their ranks. Tell me, where do those terrorists get their money, their hardware, their military experts? How did it happen that this Islamic State, the ISIS, has become a strong battle group, essentially? As for financial aid for terrorists, nowadays it's not only revenues from drug trafficking, which, by the way, increased manifold during the US-led military presence in Afghanistan. But we also see terrorist activities nowadays funded by illegal oil trade and oil trafficking. They deliver oil themselves, they transport it illegally, and they sell it illicitly at illegal prices. But if there are sellers, then there are buyers. Someone has been buying that oil, not caring that by virtue of that they effectively finance terrorists who can one day come to their own countries and start taking lives there. And where do those Islamic terrorists get their new recruits? In Iraq. After the deposition of Saddam Hussein, state institutions were effectively destroyed, including their armed forces. We were actually warning the West back then, saying, look, you are driving all those people, all those males, into unemployment. What are they supposed to do now? How are they going to support themselves and their families? These people used to be the leadership of a relatively large and strong country. What are you leaving them for? Now, what we have seen is tens of thousands of former Iraqi army servicemen and Ba'athist party members have become rank and file of the Islamic State, and they are military professionals. Russia has warned numerous times how dangerous it is to interfere in the domestic affairs of sovereign states and to aid terrorists. We insisted that organizations fighting against the central government in Syria would be included to the list of terrorist organizations, primarily ISIS. But what have we seen? Our calls were not healed. It seems to us that our Western counterparts keep fighting the vices and the menaces that they brew themselves, that they breed themselves. Dear colleagues, the period of a unipolar world has demonstrated to us vividly that building up a single power center does not make global processes in the world more manageable. On the contrary, this architecture has proved itself highly unstable and incapable of resolving issues such as regional conflicts, terrorism, religious fanaticism, neo-Nazism and chauvinism. At the same time, this architecture has provided plenty of opportunities for public opinion manipulation and trampling on the will of minorities or weaker states by stronger states. A unipolar world is basically an apology of a dictatorship and of hegemony of some states over others. And actually, the unipolar world has proved unaffordable and unmanageable for the self-appointed hegemon themselves. And hence we see these attempts at restoring a bipolar world nowadays as a comfortable vehicle, as a comfortable architecture for preserving American leadership. And it doesn't mean who will play the role as the new empire of evil these days, occupy the spot once taken by the Soviet Union, whether it's going to be Iran, China or Russia. Once again, we see attempts to split up the world, to draw dividing lines, to hammer together coalitions aimed against someone specifically rather than in favor of something, shape an image of an enemy, same as it was back in the time of the Cold War, and get this kind of effective leadership. We all remember how it was at the time of the Cold War. The U.S. used to tell their allies, we have a common enemy, a common foe, that is an empire of evil. We are protecting you, we protect our allies, and that gives us the right to give you orders and to force you to sacrifice your political and economic interests, to incur costs for collective defense that we will be in charge of. Nowadays, in a new world we're living in, we are seeing attempts at pursue similar ways of running the world in order to score political and economic points. Such attempts are not only increasingly detached from reality, they're also in conflict with the global diversity, and they will inevitably call for reciprocal action, and hence they will have an adverse effect. We see what happens when you mix politics with the economy, and when you substitute a logic of cooperation with a logic of confrontation, even when it is contrary to national business interests. Joint economic projects, mutual investments bring countries together, and that's an objective fact. They help us mitigate the existing intergovernmental problems and issues. But nowadays, the global business community is experiencing unprecedented pressure from Western governments. What kind of pragmatism can we talk about when they have this motto, the free world is in danger, democracy is in danger, we need to mobilize to repel the threat? well, that is mobilization policy as they come. The sanctions are undermining WTO rules, the principles of property. They undermine the model of globalization based on the free market and competition. That is a model that Western countries are the main beneficiaries of. Now they risk losing confidence as the leaders of globalization. My question is, why would they do that? The prosperity of the United States depends greatly upon its investors, those who hold America's state securities and the dollar. We see that confidence being strongly undermined. The Cyprus precedent and the politically motivated sanctions have only increased tendencies for economic and monetary sovereignization, for independence. It is apparent that countries and regions would like to secure themselves against external pressure. We see ever more nations trying to quit their dependence on the dollar by establishing some new reserve currencies and settlement and payment systems. I think our American counterparts are essentially sowing a branch they're sitting on. You cannot mix politics and the economy, but this is what they're doing. I've always believed that politically motivated sanctions would be a mistake that will cost everyone dearly. We understand whose pressure was there to push through these measures, these decisions. But I would like to stress that Russia is not going to act as someone who's been offended. We're not going to ask someone about anything. We are self-sustainable, and we will be working in the current economic situation. We'll be more proactive in our reforms, and this external pressure will only consolidate us, as it has happened so many times in the past. It will keep us from growing complacent, and it will make us focus on the key directions for development. We are not going to go for some kind of isolated development. We will always be in favor of developing our political and economic relations, and we count on the attitude of the leading business communities of the world. It has been said numerously during the deliberations here that Russia is turning its back on its Western partners, on Europe, and looking for new strategic partners in Asia. I can tell you that is not so. Russia's active policies in the Asia-Pacific did not start yesterday because of the sanctions. It dates back several years. And like with so many other countries, including Western countries, our rationale in promoting our Asian cooperation was merely the fact that Asia, that Southeast Asia especially, was gaining an ever-increasing role in global politics and especially the global economy. Like I said, everyone does it, and we will do that too, especially considering the fact that Russia has a vast share of its territory located in Asia. So why would not we use that opportunity? That would not be reasonable. Joint integration projects and the economic cooperation provide Russia a serious incentive for its own domestic economic development. Present-day global trends show us that dependence upon a single global power will decrease in the years to come. And actually, even American and Western experts acknowledge that. We might see in the global politics the same trends that we see in the global economy, and that is intense competition in certain niche, rapidly and fast-changing leaders in certain areas. That's all possible. Of course, humanitarian factors will play an increased role, including education, research, culture, and so on. And of course, that will influence international relations, because soft power will depend more from the real achievements in terms of human capital, rather on propaganda proficiency. At the same time, a polycentric world that we see emerging will not strengthen stability as such. Rather, on the contrary, a global equilibrium becomes a rather difficult task, a rather difficult equation. So what are we looking at if we choose to live without rules. So what are we looking at if we choose to live without rules? So what are we looking at if we choose to live without rules?
Living without rules. Very interesting. Well, believe it or not, there are rules that govern positive human interactions. Those rules of life can be found as taught by Yeshua Hawkins and the House of Yahweh. And you can find out what you can do to live a peaceful, joyous, and healthy life by following those very rules that Yahweh the Creator himself instituted for mankind. Here's what you can do.
Contact the House of Yahweh and request your free Prophetic Word magazine or monthly newsletter. You can write them at The House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites, www.yahweh.com, www.yisraelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can email them at info@yahweh.com, and for any calls outside the United States, please call the number on your screen.
Up next, Yeshua Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.